All right. We're still don't see anyone coming in yet. Oh, there's one person. Welcome. Welcome to that person who was come in. Um, Barbara. We're still waiting for people to come in. Okay, we were getting some more names. Hello, Barbara. Hello, Carol and Jennifer. Keenan, please let us know where you're tuning in from. Um, what brought you here today? Have you read Maya's book yet? If you haven't, I will be dropping a link in the chat to purchase the book. Hello, John and Mary Jane. Um, and we're just waiting for some more folks. While people are coming in, I'll just go ahead and get started. Hi, if this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. And thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for Hangman. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. If you are not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. If once you become a member, you'll receive free admission to our author programs such as this one. You'll receive free admission to the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. Please visit our website for more information or reach out to me and I can let you know what it takes to become a member. Now on to our guests. Our author, Maya Binyam, is a writer whose work has appeared in the Paris Review, the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, New York Book Forum, Columbia Journalism Review, the New York Times Book Review, and many other publications. She is a contributing editor at the Paris Review and has previously worked as an editor at Triple Canopy and the New Inquiry, and as a lecturer in the New School's Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism program. Our moderator, Alex Jennings, is a writer, editor, teacher, poet, living in New Orleans. He was born in Wiesbaden, Germany, and raised in Botswana, Tunisia, Suriname, and the United States. He constantly devours pop culture and writes mostly jokes on Twitter. And his debut novel, The Ballad of Perilous Graves, was published last year, and we had a program for his novel. So you can go to our YouTube channel to check it out and to check out this webinar once we post it in the next day or so. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, you can post that directly into the Q&A section. It's at the bottom left of the screen. You can also click on captions to see live auto captioning for this program. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase Hangman through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So I will turn this over to Maya and Alex, and I hope that you enjoy.
Well, hello. Wait, where is Maya? Okay, gotcha.
I'm here. Can you see me?
Yes, I can see you now.
Okay, great.
So it's great to be here tonight. I'm very excited to talk to you about this book. I loved it, and I felt like I connected with it on an unusual level as like a foreign service brat. I've moved around the world, but I've never really returned to any of the countries that I lived in besides the United States. And so it really struck a chord with me. But as for my first question, first novels often take a while to come into the world. So was the path to publication direct for Hangman, or was it a more circuitous route? And as a bonus, where were you when the idea first came to you?
Well, the path to publication for this particular book was fairly direct. But before I was writing this book, I was attempting to write another book which was quite different. It was likewise, or it likewise involved the relationship between two brothers. And Hangman, that relationship is sort of in the background. It affects the mechanisms of the plot, but it's not something that's brought to the forefront. But in this other book I was working on, it was substantively what the book was interested in. And the voice was pretty different. And it was something that I was kind of working on very slowly while I was also holding a full-time job and doing other kinds of work outside of that. So it was very slow and mechanical, and eventually became very boring to me. And I decided, kind of in a frenzy, that I wanted to work on something else. And that was in part precipitated by the fact that I had decided to take time off of my full-time job to go to a writing residency, which is where the idea for Hangman kind of came about. I think it was before that, probably months before that, that I had the idea to structure a book around the journey toward a funeral. But when the idea came to me, it was so vague as to be completely unhelpful. And it wasn't until I actually sat down and started to write at this residency that the idea became something more than germinal. But once I did draft this, the path to publication was pretty direct. And the writing itself was more seamless than the thing I had kind of been very slowly plodding through.
Okay. It seems, how to put this exactly? It seems like the writing, like the drafting process probably went pretty smoothly and quickly. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was smooth. The first draft I wrote fairly quickly. A lot changed in editing, but the process of writing itself felt pleasurable and smooth. Yeah, like you said.
Okay. So do you draw a deep divide between your editing work and your writing? Like, how do they inform each other?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's the answer, I guess, has evolved in time. I've always edited alongside writing. I've always held a full-time editing job. This is the first time in my life now that editing is something that I do on the side in a kind of piecemeal way. But I think that when I started out, I tended to think that editing turned me into a more careful reader of my own work. I think in a kind of best case scenario, editing can make you more attuned to other people's tics and habits of writing. And like I said, in the best case scenario where you're encountering an author who has a distinctive voice and a kind of idea for where they're going, editing can feel like helping someone sound more like themselves or something, or more like the voice that's emerging in the text. And I think as I was doing that across genres and across various styles of writing, I also became more attuned to the habits that I was employing in my own writing, some of which I think were interesting, many of which were unhelpful and were kind of impulses that I had developed out of bad habit or something. And so editing became a way to excise some of those habits and accentuate other ones. I mean, it's a vague answer, but when you work editing text all day, you do become more attuned to what texts can do and where they falter. And for a long time, I found those two things, or doing those two things, to be beneficial in my life and pretty fruitful. But at a certain point, as I'm sure you know, as I'm sure many people who are listening know, it's very difficult to write when you have a full-time job doing something else, even if that full-time job involves engaging writing. And at a certain point, I do think working as a full-time editor did become detrimental to my writing, not because I wasn't learning from editing anymore, but because at a certain point, you need time to write. So it's been both kind of something that is fundamentally helpful and also like distracting, practically distracting.
Would you say your approach to writing generally is more intuitive or more, what's the word, more practical?
Yeah, it's very intuitive. I mean, I'm not a writer, and I guess this is specifically for fiction. I have different processes for writing nonfiction, but for fiction in particular, I'm not someone who goes in with an outline or even with a concrete sense for where a story is going to end up. I think the discovery is in the process of writing itself. And writing this book in particular, the voice was something that was very, very familiar to me. I had a sense for the narrator's style of observation, his sense of humor. And so I could kind of place him in various scenarios and just see where things went. I feel like writers often talk about following characters, and it didn't feel quite like that because I was, of course, constructing him as I was writing. But I did feel like because I knew the voice so well, I could introduce elements that surprised even me. Like when I would sit down to write, I wouldn't necessarily know what was going to happen in a scene or who the narrator was going to encounter. And I could kind of allow the sort of subconscious workings of my mind to introduce those elements, and then I could enable him to react. And that style of writing I find very pleasurable because it winds up acting as a kind of map of the unconscious or something. So personally, I find it helpful. And I also tend to feel really hemmed in when I have an outline that can kind of deaden the writing for me. And I think a lot of people feel that way. I mean, I don't know what your style of writing is if you are an outliner, but I've heard from a lot of people who do outline that even if they have some sense for where they're going, even if they've written down some plan, they ultimately wind up deviating from it. So I feel like for almost everyone, there's that kind of alchemy between what you think is going to happen and what winds up happening when you actually sit down at your computer or at your notebook or whatever.
I think so. At least that's how it is for me. I came to outlining very late,
Yeah.
at least in an effective way. I had to do an outline for my second book before writing it, just because I had a 3-book deal with Orbit, and it was kind of an agonizing process, and I don't recommend, but I'm glad I have the skill now. How closely would you say the main character is based on your father? Is there any of him in there?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is. It's really hard to trace where a voice comes from. I can say that the narrator shares certain biographical details with my father. And for anyone who's read the book, you know that those biographical details are kind of parceled out along the way. They're not immediately apparent. But I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that he was a political prisoner, that he fled his home country and found refuge elsewhere. And those are details that are true basically of my father. And there's certainly aspects of the narrator's voice that are gleaned from him. It's hard, honestly, to chart which ones, just because I think even if you write something fictional that's meant to adhere to a person that exists in the real world through the process of writing, of course, that person changes. And in this case, I was not trying so concretely to write about him, though his voice was certainly an influence, and his style of observation was an influence, and certainly what's transpired in his life in the broadest strokes was an influence to me. And there are also a number of stories in the book. Again, for those who haven't read it, there is kind of a central plot or a forward movement in the book, but it's also attended by lots of side narratives. Many of the people that the narrator encounters on his journey confess their life stories to him almost impulsively, regardless of whether or not he wants to hear them. And some of those stories are stories that, you know, are entirely made up. They're mysterious. It's mysterious to even me where they came from. But others relate pretty closely to stories of friends and family that have been relayed to me, often by my father. So there are certainly symmetries, but it's hard to say how much of it all comes from him.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned in a previous interview that you weren't deeply affected by the book's ideas until after it was written and edited. Could you say a little bit more about that? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I was writing the book, it was a really pleasurable, as I said, process. It was a very fun time in my life. I was at this residency that felt luxurious in a lot of ways, not only because of the amenities that were provided, but because it was the first time in my life when people or an institution were making space for me to create something or not create something. And I was kind of free to decide what that something was. So that was like intensely enabling and felt very good. And, you know, I was eating well and swimming and hiking and just enjoying the process of writing a lot. And oftentimes because I think I was writing things on impulse, I wasn't necessarily aware of how they were acting on me in the moment. And then I had about, how long did I edit the book for? I think it was about a year and a half or something. And even as I was editing, I was, of course, thinking about how things were working in the context of the book. And I was thinking about how to crystallize certain ideas, but I wasn't necessarily vulnerable to those ideas as I was expressing them. Like, I felt like, you know, I was kind of a manipulator, but I wasn't subject to them in the way that a reader is. And it wasn't until I finished editing that I was, and it's not because I read the book at that point, but I do think with some distance from some of the ideas, I became upset by them. And that's not because all of the ideas in the book are upsetting, but there are things that happen in the book that in some ways, I think, I don't know, we're a kind of prefiguration of things that I'm fearful. Like, there are characters in the book who bear some resemblance to people that I care about and who I love. And in the book, they go through things that are bad. And I think it sort of forced me to deal with things and think about things that were otherwise sort of in the background of my mind, but by writing them, I made those things explicit. And I guess I'm talking vaguely, but I mean to say that those things were like illness and death,
right.
and the death of particular people in my life, which, yeah, were not at the forefront of my thinking, but once I wrote the book, they were sort of made explicit. And so I think the book became, yeah, kind of upsetting to me, or forced me to go through this, I don't know, a kind of grieving process that didn't make so much sense because it wasn't reliant on things that were happening in the world actually, but it depended on this book that I had written, which did put things, at least, yeah, it put things out into the world that I was then kind of responding to, even though I wasn't actually dealing with them. I don't know if that sounds like complicated to me now that I'm saying it, but
I mean, I think I get what you mean.
yeah.
You know, perspective shifts like that just kind of go with the territory. It's important, and I kind of feel like when you have them based on a significant work that you're doing, it's always a good sign, because how
Yeah.
can you expect to, change readers in some way if you're not being changed by the process yourself.
Right, right. I think that's true. I think that's true. It was just surprising to me that I was changed by the process only after the book was meant to be done.
Right.
But it's my first
Yeah.
book, so perhaps this is how it always goes.
When I read that interview where you mentioned that, it kind of reminded me of when I used to do stand-up. And at first, I only got stage fright after getting off stage after a set,
Weird.
which
Yeah.
was, I mean, it was useful because it was crushing. But
Yeah. Yeah, you only realize what you've been through after it's already happened or something.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes you need that kind of time and distance to process, what you've done.
Yeah.
Now, I definitely want to talk about the voice and the narration of this book because there's something truly unique about it. Like it's like the style is relatively spare, and there isn't a ton of direct metaphor there, although there
Mhm.
is a lot, like there appears to be a lot of symbolism. Um, Now you mentioned elsewhere that the main character does not have a writerly sensibility, but how far through the process of writing were you when you realized that, and how did that understanding help shape the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started writing, I didn't know that about him. I knew that he was a reluctant narrator of his own life, but I didn't know that he was kind of opposed to the novelistic project until I was partially through. But when I began writing, I think I used it as a kind of challenge to myself to not include metaphors in the book. And I wasn't sure why exactly I had that impulse. Maybe it was a kind of defensive impulse um, against what I perceived to be an overuse of bad metaphors in I don't know, the writing that I was encountering. But as I continued writing, I found that that absence of metaphorical thinking was in fact a big part of who the narrator was. And what I mean when I say that he doesn't have a writerly sensibility, I mean both that, yeah, he's a reluctant narrator of his own life, but also he is very actively resisting the kinds of stories that he might otherwise be expected to fulfill. Like he knows that he's an immigrant returning to his home country. He knows at a certain point, he says explicitly that the story of the immigrant returning to his home country is supposed to be a good one. And he's willing to fulfill the narrative obligations of that kind of story. He writes at a certain point an email to his wife saying that he's having a wonderful time. His family has welcomed him. He's eating all this food, when in fact he's actually having a bad time. He's losing all of his stuff. He isn't able to recognize his family. What he does eat, he isn't able to digest. But he doesn't he he doesn't want to tell that story. He's willing to oblige the convention of an immigrant going home and having yeah, and having a warm welcome, even though that isn't what he's experiencing. But also he's resistant to the kinds of I guess communal narrative making that necessarily happen when two people interact with each other. As I said before, almost everyone he encounters sort of compulsively tells him the various stories of their lives. And he's a willing listener. He's a very polite person, but he isn't willing to respond in kind, which is the kind of convention of conversation. One person relinquishes something, and then the other person relinquishes that same thing or a similar thing in turn. And I say relinquish because that's really how he thinks about conversation. Like he thinks that if he talks about himself, he's giving something up. And he's not willing to do that. And not only is he not willing to do that, but he's also very resistant to the idea that what other people are saying about themselves could have something to do with him. so he also resists meaning making in that way. And I think writers are very invested in language as a source of meaning making. And he is very resistant to that. He's kind of adamant over and over and over again that the stories that people tell about themselves have no meaning. They're just a way of sorting through events that basically all of us live through. And it's a strange perspective for him to take in some ways, because he's had a fairly unique life. And we learn that there are details in his past that seem at once extraordinary. He's gone through a lot of suffering, but he's unwilling to see those extraordinary events as anything but ordinary. He's kind of, I don't know, he's both insistent that he belongs to the masses, that everything he's gone through is something that other people go through all the time. And at the same time, he wants to be held apart from them. He isn't actually willing to commune with other people based on their shared experience. And so I think that's what I mean when I say that he's without the kind of, writerly sensibility.
Right. He does seem to have issues with closeness and intimacy, and those issues seem to be amplified by his present circumstance. So it's like fascinating to watch that unfold. I did notice that there is a possibly speculative interpretation for the whole story. Like if one chose to view it through that lens, one could. Was that intentional, or is that just something that kind of happened?
I mean, I think I have a pretty clear reading of the book in terms of my understanding of the events that condition his return back to his home country, and also the assumptions that he's making and how those are overturned by the end of the book. But I think despite my own clarity, I think there are multiple ways of interpreting it. And also the sort of clear narrative that I'm referencing is not a realist one. Like it's not one that that is so concrete. Like there's bound to be sort of like multiple versions contained within it. I did certainly intend for someone to be able to read the book once and think that they're reading one thing and then reread it in light of the end and perhaps realize that they were reading something else. So I do think there's that kind of like duality or doubleness inherent to the book. And that was something I experienced while writing it too. When I began the book, I didn't know how it was going to end. I knew the narrator at a certain point began to believe that he was attending a funeral. I knew that he would begin to believe that it was his brother's funeral. I wasn't sure whose funeral it actually was. So I think that sort of multiplicity was contained within the writing process. And once I did know what was going to happen by the end, which was probably halfway through, I wanted to maintain the illusion that something else was going to happen at the end than what does.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that. You've talked before a lot about the tension between legal refuge or refugee status and actual refuge. Like what do those terms mean to you, and how do they shed light on the story?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, so refuge as it's used in the legal framework, the legal context in the US, it's a political term. It's a term with shifting meaning. It's dependent on the relationship between the US and the various nations that it accepts or doesn't accept refugees from. And it's also a very vague term. It's not one that has a legally binding definition, but obviously it tends to connote safety and livelihood and life itself, especially when it's juxtaposed to a country of origin, which again, in the legal context, must be a place where someone is experiencing persecution or fears persecution based on their belonging to some kind of social group in almost every instance. So in the legal context, the refuge and the country of origin are completely opposed. One is a site of death or potential death, and the other is a site of life. And I think, you know, my father came to the States as a refugee. Many of the people that I grew up with on his side of the family came to the States as refugees or asylees. And I saw the ways in which the sort of legal ideal of refuge, which is also a temporary thing. Refuge is supposed to be a state that people pass through. People aren't meant to be refugees their entire lives. They're not meant to live in the US in refuge forever. It's this kind of temporary protected state that's meant to melt away when the political condition in a country of origin changes and people can go back to their home country. But what I found, you know, growing up in a community of refugees in Boston was that the kind of ideals of refuge conflicted with the lived experience. And in fact, the distinctions between life in refuge and death in a country of origin became completely confused, because if you're living in the US as a Black person, the idea that the state could provide refuge, could provide the conditions of refuge is obviously absurd. Like it's a farce. And so what I was more compelled by when I was a child was the ways in which people produced the conditions of refuge together, and often in ways that weren't condoned by the state, in ways that were extra legal or surreptitious or just completely ordinary. And I've really been interested in that tension, and also very invested in it, and invested in the ways that communities of people can amongst themselves provide the things that the state presumes to provide, but in fact is unable to provide, and oftentimes endangers. But to speak to how that relates to the book, I think the narrator, having gone through the process of seeking refuge, is really attached to the sort of legal narrative that attends it. He's left his home country behind. We learned that he was a political prisoner and left the country as an exile. And leaving his home country required leaving collective life behind so that he could save his life. And by virtue of the fact that he's found refuge in a country that looks a lot like the United States, he tends to think of himself as someone who is safe, as someone who is resourced, someone who is fundamentally healthy, for whom if he becomes unhealthy, he'll be able to access the resources to make himself better. And he tends to think of himself in distinction to the people who have not left, his friends and family members, and especially his brother, who is still in the country where he's come from, and who makes near constant asks for money, for medicine, and eventually for food. And when he goes back to his home country, he really holds himself against it, even as he wants to belong again to the collective. He thinks that he is fundamentally different, because he believes, resourced and healthy, and the other people that he encounters kind of become metonyms for what the country has gone through in his absence. So he tends to read them as signifiers, as signifiers of the country's poverty most often, and that gets localized in his relationship with his brother. But I think it's kind of the mission of the book to show the ways in which that narrative is a kind of mythology, and is duplicitous, and is fundamentally untrue. So I think that's sort of the relation between those various things.
Yeah, I do think with everything that's happening in terms of like the climate shift and man-made disasters, we saw with Hurricane Katrina that the displaced people were termed as refugees and treated like refugees in a lot of ways. And I feel like we're going to see that more and more going forward.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the US is typically seen as a place that receives refugees. It's not seen as producing refugees, but of course it does all of the time because people are forced to flee the conditions that the state enables, either because of climate crisis, like you mentioned, but also the earliest Black refugees in this country were people who were fleeing slavery. So from its very inception, the U.S. has been a place that that presumes to provide the conditions of refuge, but also obviously endangers people, and in particular Black people, and forces Black people to become refugees in what's understood to be their own country.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating conundrum, and I feel like
Yeah.
volumes are going to be written on it very soon. Let's see. How many passes did you make at the novel, before you felt it was ready to go out?
To go out, like to be published.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, it was probably 6 or 7 drafts that I wrote. Yeah.
Okay. There's definitely an ease to the writing, like the writing and language are deceptively simple, even though they're freighted with so much meaning. Um, and like I like the tension between all the meaning that's been infused and like the refusal of the narrator to make assumptions about a meaning beyond physical fact. I really liked that about it. It's something that kind of kept me on my toes the entire time.
I'm happy to hear that.
So how did you choose which biographical details to reveal for your protagonist and which ones to keep under wraps? Was it
Yeah,
conscious?
that's a really good question. It was conscious. It was. I wrote the first draft, and even then I was consciously thinking about which details to reveal. I mean, there were certain things like I knew at the very beginning that I wasn't going to reveal his name immediately, but I didn't know if I was going to reveal it at some later point. But as I began writing, it became clear to me that he didn't have a name, and that his not having a name was necessary for the book to kind of hold together, and that the namelessness was something that I was actually interested in. But a lot of the other things, like his having been, I knew it was going to be revealed that he had been a political prisoner, that he had been a refugee and an exile. I wasn't sure when those things were going to come in. I wasn't sure how much they were going to enter the text. Initial drafts, I sort of had suffused with much more description and recollection. But I ultimately wound up excising almost all of the passages of straightforward recollection, because it wound up feeling like they were important to me in the process of writing, but in some way antithetical to the character as he was developing. But I certainly wrote out not necessarily backstory for him, but I did write out for myself what the significance of various details were, if that makes sense. Like, I certainly had some idea for how long he had been in prison. I had some idea for, I guess, what his relationship with his son is. We learn at a certain point that he has a son, though again, it's not such a spoiler. Yeah, I guess I wrote out sort of narrative significance for these various details, that stayed private. I didn't put them in the text, but I didn't write out a backstory, and it was tricky. It was really tricky. Like it really was a kind of balancing act, and other readers were immensely helpful to me. I had an excerpt of the book was published pretty early on when I was still in the stages of editing the whole thing, and the person who edited that, Lydia Haas, who's a wonderful editor, got on the phone with me and asked me very, very simple questions about the narrator and what he had gone through. And the answers to those questions didn't make their way in the text necessarily, but answering them for myself, I think, I don't know, just helped me figure out the significance of what was obscured, and also helped me figure out what had been obscured purposefully and what was necessary to obscure, and what had been obscured due to sloppiness on my part. Because no matter what, a first draft, a second draft, a third draft, whatever, there's going to be lots of sloppiness in it.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that was an interesting lesson to learn. Like when I was doing the drafts of my novel as we were in production, like, you know, sometimes a draft would get worse in terms of quality. And when that first happened, it was very shocking and very worrisome to me.
Yeah. Well,
I'm
it's
glad it
hard
went.
to know. It's hard to know when you're editing. It's hard to know how to maintain the aliveness of the thing that initially came to mind. And in the best case scenario, editing can make something feel more alive. But I always feel like there's this tipping point when you can edit too much and make an alive thing feel dead, even if it's technically more coherent or something, if that makes
Right.
sense. And it's so hard. It's so hard as a writer to know what that tipping point is. I think especially writing a first book, maybe, I don't know, maybe it gets easier later on, but writing a first book, there's so much pressure to make it just right, that you can start to feel like you need to edit forever or something.
Okay. What is happening?
I
I'm
can hear
having
you.
some. Okay, you can hear me? Good.
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm having some technical details. I don't know. All right, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna stop using this camera and I'm sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay, good. All right. Anyway, so one thing I noticed that there is a strong significance to food and eating in the book, and like
Yeah.
when eating works and when it doesn't. Um, what what brought that about? Like it seems like a very classical sort of consideration. Like it made me think of like old fairy stories where
Mm.
when one is inside the mound, one can't eat or drink, or they'll be trapped there forever.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I kind of love that as a reference, because there are these kind of quiet or invisible rules for eating in this novel. But I mean, I'm really interested in food in general in my life. Unlike the narrator, I take a lot of pleasure in food, but it's one of those things that I don't know, I just find it so strange. It's at once this intensely practical thing, like we need to eat in order to have energy to move about our daily lives, but then it's imbued with so much symbolic meaning and fantasy, and people, when they eat, they're both satisfying this innate need, but then also doing all this projecting um onto the food item. So it's just a really interesting thing to me. And for the narrator, like I said, obviously he's aware of the fact that he's an immigrant returning to his home country, and that the story of the immigrant returning to his home country is meant to be a good one, and a kind of I guess a cliche of that kind of story is that the food will be very good, and that the person experiencing the return will be reconnected with tastes that she, or in this case he, haven't encountered for a very long time. And the narrator wants that. Like the narrator wants to be eating food that's delicious that he hasn't seen or eaten for a while. But when he arrives, he finds that the food, even if it looks good, doesn't necessarily enter his body in a welcomed way. He has lots of problems with indigestion. He has heartburn at one point, though he doesn't really describe it that way. He gets constipated, and eventually the food that he's eating is in fact inedible. And it was certainly something I was thinking of consciously. The narrator is someone who, as I said, is very reluctant. He's reluctant to make himself vulnerable to things.
Right.
And food and eating it requires being vulnerable to the environs. You're literally ingesting something. And because he's unwilling to do that, I mean, food in particular, it calls a lot of attention to the body as membrane. I think a lot of us walk through our lives, I at least do, under the illusion that our bodies are kind of impermeable. And when we eat, and when we feel things because we eat, that illusion is completely punctured. Like we can become susceptible to something as seemingly benign as a banana or whatever. But anyway, the narrator is very cautiously guarding the border between himself and others, which gets kind of literalized in his body. And that to me explains why food sits so badly and uncomfortably with him.
Yeah. So did you decide from the start to begin the book on the plane during the flight, or was that something that came later?
Yeah, that was the first scene I wrote. And I wrote that scene chronologically too. So the first sentence of the book was the first one that I wrote. And I don't know I don't know how I knew that I wanted to begin it on the plane, but that is where I begin it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so much of significance happens there, like him squirreling the food away after rejecting it and carrying it with him until it becomes a serious problem. And it also functions as a sort of metaphoric underpinning for the entire story, like what he goes through, how he interacts with the information he's given. I really liked that touch a lot.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to hear that. I mean, planes are and airports generally, I find to be such fascinating and alien spaces. They're places that really guide behavior. In an airport, all of us do basically the same things. And when we get on a plane, especially a long plane ride, we're all kind of subject to these conventions of eating and drinking that are determined by the airline. We all kind of give up our eating habits and we eat at these pre-designated times and our choices are limited. And it's always strange to me when I experience that. And I find it kind of mystifying and frustrating that so many people begin to act as a kind of like de facto community based on these standards that have been set forth by an airline. And the narrator is certainly experiencing some of that himself. But also airports are a place where you're or where I at least feel completely anonymous because I'm in a sea of people and acting in a way that I'm being guided to act. But at the same time, you're forced to identify yourself over and over and over again. So, but just by showing your ID or showing your face or whatever. So I think I was and am really interested in that confluence of complete alienation and then intense and specific identification that can happen in those spaces.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite airport?
Oh, that's such a good question. I really hate airports. I really, really hate airports. And I'm just learning that not everyone hates airports. Like people, I don't know, some people like to eat breakfast in them or whatever, or get a drink. And I just hate the experience so much. But so it's easier for me to think of least favorite airports. Like I hate O'Hare.
Oh,
I think it's just like it's the worst. It's so big and horrible. I hate LAX. I do kind of have a fondness for the Boston airport.
Okay.
It's pretty small. And I like Burbank. Burbank is a really good airport. It feels like a small town airport. Like, have you flown into there or out of there?
Not to Burbank, never.
Oh my God. Okay. Next time you have to go to LA, try to get a flight into or out of Burbank. You arrive on the plane and they lay out the staircase onto the tarmac and you get to walk outside immediately.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, it's incredible. But you're in LA, you're in like a major American city, but it feels like, I don't know, it just feels small and comforting.
I mean, my favorite airport probably doesn't exist in the form where I encountered it. The first time I left the country with my family, we went to Paramaribo, Suriname to live for 2 years.
Mm.
And the international airport there had no AC. Like you landed on the tarmac from like a propeller plane. And when we walked inside the terminal, there were all of these like what I thought were off-center designs on the tiles, but it
Mhm.
actually turned out that they were these really big black beetles who were
Oh my
attracted
God.
by the lights of the airport and were just around and they couldn't do anything about them.
Wow. Yeah, I love airports that are just basically outside, that are barely
Mhm.
airports, that like have the minimal structure to conjure the idea of an airport. But yeah, yeah, those are the best ones.
Oh, we're running low on time. Well, okay. So what are you working on now? Anything you can talk about?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm basically in a stage where I'm trying to uh manifest the conditions to be able to work on something. I'm so uh I don't know, I'm so particular and ritualistic about how I write, and I'm really trying to get better at that. I would love to be someone who writes just wakes up in the morning and writes wherever they are, but I'm really not. I have to kind of write in isolated spurts. So,
Mhm.
no, I'm more in the place where I'm anticipating writing soon.
Yeah, I know how that is.
Yeah.
What residency were you at when you composed the first draft? Do you like which one
I was
was
at
that?
I was at Blue Mountain Center in the Adirondacks. I really recommend it to anyone who is looking to go to a residency. It's kind of unconventional as an artist residency because it includes um, artists, visual artists, writers, musicians, and activists. Um, and it's just fantastic. It's really beautiful up there. The people who run it are great. And there's very little programming, so you can kind of get up to your own thing.
Yeah, I wish more residencies were multidisciplinary in that way.
I
Um,
know.
I attended Under the Volcano in Tepoztlan, Mexico, a couple years ago, and that was a real eye opener. And one of the things that made it so great was that it was for journalism, for poetry, for memoir, for speculative fiction, and for literary fiction. It was really great to interact with everyone. I wish there had been visual artists though.
That sounds great though. I'll check it out.
Let's see. I think we've been through most of my questions. Um, but okay, what are you reading right
I just finished today reading The Journalist and the Murderer, the Janet Malcolm book.
now? Okay.
I was for this whole summer, I was reading a ton of Toni Morrison, which is, not the most original answer, but it's been so good. It's been really good. I've been reading some books that I haven't read since high school, and then reading ones that I had never read before, like Tar Baby, was a book that I had strangely never read and was amazing. Yeah.
I feel like there's always something new to find in her work. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
um so what books are you excited about in the near future? What's coming out that's kind of on your radar?
It's a good question. There's a poetry book by Elisa Gonzalez called Grand Tour that's coming out later this month. That's really excellent. It is sort of deeply enmeshed in the various structures that I don't know, conjure a family and a sense of self within one and without one. And I found it so, I don't know, just so good to read. There's also a new novel that just came out called The History of a Difficult Child by Miret Sabat, that is set in Ethiopia. So I have a kind of fondness for it. But it also has this kind of like indelible, difficult narrator who is a young child, but sees the world with this unlikely wisdom that I found like just so engrossing. So those are two that I have on my radar, and one of them is available now.
Yeah, my family lived in Ethiopia during the Civil War, and so there are a lot
Oh
of like
wow.
family stories about that time. It's
Wow.
it's fascinating, especially like, they were expatriates and everything. So at one point, the rest of the family had to evacuate, and my dad stayed when they ejected uh, half the embassy personnel.
Wow. Were you there too?
No, I wasn't there. This is before I was born.
Okay,
Like we
before.
were
Okay.
living in Botswana when I was born.
Wow. Okay. Well, I have questions about that.
Oh, absolutely. Is there a question that you either wish interviewers would ask or that you wish that they would ask more often?
Hmm. It's a good question. I mean, nothing immediately comes to mind. In general, I've found that people who have read the book and asked me questions have been really inventive in their question asking. So it's kind of a cop out, but no, I don't, there isn't anything that I've been dying to be asked, I don't think. Um, yeah, in general, I felt surprised by people's questions.
Well, that's fair.
Yeah,
Do we have any questions from the audience? How much time have we left?
it
I
looks like
think
we have
only,
2 minutes, but I do see
yeah.
some questions.
Oh, where? I'm not seeing them.
Oh, they're just at the bottom, the Q&A, but I can also read them.
Please.
Um, okay, I see Maya, reading Hangman reminded me of reading Franz Kafka's work. Do you consider his writing an influence on your own work? I've gotten this before, not necessarily in the form of a question, but people have made comparisons or described the writing as Kafka-esque. And I've only read the very beginning of the trial. I haven't otherwise read Kafka. But I don't know if you feel this way, Alex, but I often influences are really difficult for me to chart. And I said even before we spoke that the one thing that I don't feel like I have much that's interesting to say about is my literary influences. And in
Right.
part, that's because it is difficult to chart, but also because I always have the strange experience of reading something new and feeling almost in retrospect like it's been an influence on things that I've written before. And I don't mean to say that I don't mean to be like so magical about it, but I do think that there's something strange that can happen with reading where um I don't know, you can feel influences retrospectively, and that's almost easier than charting influences when you're in the process of writing something. So I always love hearing about what other people think of. But no, when I was writing Kafka I wasn't imagining Kafka as a direct influence on the work. Though I'm of course familiar with it and can kind of see those similarities.
Thank you for putting that idea of retroactive influence into words. That's something that I've felt for a long time and have never found the words to close the
Yeah.
thought.
Well, it's so weird. It feels like impossible in some sense and then totally intuitive in another.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, I found the Q&A.
Okay, great.
So Barbara Stark asked, agree to the Kafka reference. I was all the time guessing. Oh wait, I was all the time guessing about what country the protagonist went back to. So I don't know if I want to know where your father came from. Do I?
Well, I don't know if you want to know it. Maybe I won't say, and if you want to know, I don't think I mentioned it in this. Well, no, we just talked about Ethiopia. He's from Ethiopia.
Yeah,
The jig is up.
I do love Ethiopia. I
Yeah,
really would like to get there someday.
you should go back.
Um, John Matheson asks, Maya, did you ever consider making the narrator a woman?
No, no. Yeah, no.
Good to know. Our next question is, you mentioned that you came into the idea of the narrator not having a novelist sensibility about halfway through writing the first draft. I find your sentences so wonderfully disorienting in that they snake back on themselves to refute and change ideas. Was this related to the narrator's lack of novelistic sensibility, or was it something you had intended from the start of the first draft?
Hmm. I mean, I think it was certainly related. I mean, it's always difficult to trace intention and the sort of meaning making that just happens once something is written. But it's especially difficult to sort of like disentangle prose style and plot and how character emerge. But I do think those two things are related, certainly. The narrator is not someone who is willing to present himself as a person whose psychology has a one-to-one relationship uh, with what he's gone through, and that is a kind of conventional novelistic or at least humanist assumption that people are um, fully cognizant of how what they've gone through shapes how they are in the world, and that isn't true for him. And I think that affects the sentences because uh as he's experiencing the various things that are happening in the novel, he's constantly undermining what they mean to him. So I think those loops of language, yeah, do have to do with his sort of anti-novelistic sensibility and his ability to narrate the things that are happening to him in the present.
There's something very powerful and I want to say frustrating, but not. I feel like that's the wrong word to use because it more intrigues me than
Mhm.
frustrates me that I know there's something directly off screen that he's not willing to let go of. It's he's recounting
Mhm.
his experiences, and
Mhm.
that's fascinating. But I guess we're at time. Um, Thank you so much for talking with me. Thank you to everyone who tuned in to be with us. Sorry about my camera. I don't know what happened there.
No, thank you so much, Alex, for taking the time and for your beautiful questions. And yeah, I'm grateful for everyone who came and asked questions or just listened. And thank you also, Omar, and everyone at the Mark Twain House for hosting this event. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much, Maya, and thanks, Alex, for acting as moderator. These technological things happen, so it's just part of living in this 21st century world. And thanks to everyone for joining us. I'll be posting recording of the webinar probably tomorrow afternoon. So just be on the lookout for that on our YouTube channel. And have a great evening.
Thank you.
Absolutely.